Our final keynote speaker, Guy Mentel, the Executive Director of Global Americans, will speak today about the strategic importance of expanded US-Ecuadorian bilateral relations. We invited Guy to speak today because of the important work that Global Americans is doing in Ecuador today. In particular, Guy has, through his leadership, has developed a high-level working group, bilateral, with leaders from both countries that are looking at a variety of issues of importance to both countries. Recently, Guy coordinated a study entitled Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Trade Relations, a Historical Perspective. A link of that report is available on the Institute's website if you go to the agenda. Guy comes to the helm of Global Americans, having held multiple positions in the US Senate, working primarily on Western Hemispheric policy, on immigration, as well as judiciary issues. In 2014, 2015, Guy worked as at Princeton as a Latin American fellow and their Center for International Justice in Bogota, Colombia. He has also worked on issues of transnational justice, armed conflict in Colombia, as well as marriage equality. He has been very active throughout Latin America over the years. He has a legal background, a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, and a certificate in WTO and International Trade Studies, as well as a BA from Georgetown University. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Guy, who will close out our forum and share with us his perspective on the bilateral US-Ecuadorian trade relationship and its importance. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that warm introduction. It's really an honor to speak here today at this conference that has had such distinguished friends and colleagues, all of whom care deeply about the hemisphere. Very grateful also to your wonderful audience that has stayed throughout these fantastic panels and presentations. I'm mindful that I am closing this series off, so I will do my very best to keep this at least a fraction as interesting as the previous panel was. Richard has generously given me a nice bucket of time to chat, so I do hope that I fulfill that promise. If I may, Richard, maybe I'll start by painting a broad picture of this current moment in US-Ecuador relations, which in my view represents a unique opening for deeper bilateral engagement. As Richard mentioned, my think tank Global Americans has been working on US-Ecuador relations for some time now, but particularly in a very intense way over the course of this past year. We formed a high-level working group that's comprised of current and former diplomats, policymakers, top players in academia in the US and Ecuadorian public and private sectors. We've also released a series of reports, as Richard alluded to, and will continue to do so in the coming weeks. So I'll talk a little bit about those findings, but also about the general US-Ecuador relationship as I see it from the work that we've done and the work that I've done on Capitol Hill before that. So I think as we've heard over these past 2 days of panels and keynotes, we have in both the Biden administration and the Lasso administration, new governments in both countries that are keen on engaging across a whole host of issues. And I have a number of issues in mind when I say that, but there's a laundry list of them. I think some include strengthening democratic institutions, increasing government transparency, modernizing government participation in capital markets, security broadly, trade broadly, climate, infrastructure development, and I think, of course, top of mind now, and we've seen this manifest itself over the course of the past couple of months, pandemic relief and recovery. So I think before I dive into the US-Ecuador relationship on a very deep level, it's worth painting what I think is increasingly becoming a somewhat dire picture of the region from the perspective here in Washington, DC. I think in less dire circumstances, we'd all be joining each other in San Diego with Hawaii shirts and cargo shorts, but we're here engaging virtually. And I think that's a regular reminder of the way in which the pandemic has affected our lives, but perhaps more so today, the lives of those all throughout the hemisphere and in particular in Latin America, where vaccination rates are not up as high as we've seen in the United States or even in Ecuador in particular. And I think the difficulty and rockiness all across the hemisphere goes beyond the pandemic, which of course I was just alluding to, and extends to the current political and economic moment in the hemisphere, and also goes to inform why Ecuador has increasingly emerged in the minds of US policymakers as a stable possible partner in an otherwise turbulent regional sea. And so what does that regional sea look like today? Well, in Peru, where political uncertainty has reigned supreme over the past many months with the election of Pedro Castillo of the Peru Libre Party, we saw final results there delayed after his rival made spurious allegations of electoral fraud. And even after Castillo's new Minister of Foreign Relations, Hector Bejar, remained in office only 19 days before resigning. And perhaps exacerbating that uncertainty, that turbulence, was the fact that Castillo now enjoys a very low approval rating, and opposition parties control a large chunk of the Peruvian legislature. In Colombia, also a longstanding partner, we've seen widespread protests, strikes, El Paro Nacional. All of that has kind of roiled the country since April 2021, such that today only 20% of Colombians approve of President Duque's presidency, with Duque having enjoyed record lows for approval over the past many months. Then in Venezuela, of course, we have a refugee crisis on par with that of Syria, with a poverty rate in excess of 90%, and Nicolas Maduro now remaining in power after holding elections recognized as illegitimate by many in the international community. That brings us to Ecuador. In Ecuador, the US sees a very different story. We see daily vaccine rates per capita dramatically increasing under President Guillermo Lasso, with Ecuador now outperforming almost every country in Latin America. We see that 74% of Ecuadorians approve of President Lasso's presidency thus far, and his government has been keen under his leadership and under that of Ambassador Baki and other figures in the government, many of whom have spoke over these past 2 days, to deepen its engagement with the United States across multiple fronts. President Lasso also appears committed, again, at least in these early days, to build unity among an otherwise fractious coalition, to look perhaps beyond longstanding ideological divisions that in many ways defined the course of the election, to navigate a whole host of obstacles in terms of public health and a ravaged economy. He really has led, as some of the speakers of the past couple of days have noted, a whole of government effort to address the pandemic. And I think actually his approval ratings are representative of how widespread the support for his efforts has been. That's not to say that obstacles don't exist. They certainly do, and they will persist. I think the legislature is one such example, largely now comprised of center-left and left parties. The legislature as an institution holds relatively low approval ratings, and the current coalition of parties supportive of the government, including the indigenous political movement Pachakutik, is quite fragile. The economic situation, as we know, is still extremely problematic, and the executive branch is now forced to engage, for better and for worse, with coalition partners and the opposition to build support for reforms and legislation that might liberalize different sectors and in turn revitalize the economy. I actually think one illustrative example of this new Lasso-Pachakutik alliance took place in May, when President Lasso's allies in the National Assembly supported Pachakutik's Guadalupe Luri, who became president of that body, president of the National Assembly, which in effect cemented this alliance between Pachakutik on the one hand and Lasso's party on the other, and in turn actually sidelined former President Rafael Correa's movement, once headlined by Andrés Arauz, a Correa protege. So the political divide actually in Ecuador right now is a particularly fascinating one, because we see a fragile coalition forming between a few leftist parties, Lasso's center-right party, with a sort of rising tide, if you will, of indigenous political activism that has been rushing and that continues to rush to fill a political vacuum left by kind of the fall, if you will, of Rafael Correa's movement in these last elections. So some in the indigenous community have forged really strong alliances with the sitting government, but we remember that very sector protested heavily against what they perceived to be unduly burdensome, shall we say, austerity-like policies of President Lenin Moreno, but they also had major disagreements with Rafael Correa, who they accused of prioritizing oil production, over the environment and over the well-being of indigenous communities generally. And so actually Guadalupe Lordi herself and Yaku Perez, who of course was Pachacutic's former presidential candidate, were both jailed by President Correa. So increasingly what we've heard, Global Americans has heard as we've conducted these engagements with Ecuador, as we've produced these reports, is that Pachacutic is seeing itself kind of caught between, or at least during the elections it did, an extractivist left on the one hand, and then a center-right government that it doesn't necessarily align with on certain issues, but that it might allow it the space to emerge as a new possible force on the left, leaving behind some of the rule of law and environmental degradation issues that really plagued and in many ways scarred Rafael Correa's administration. So it's my view that the alliances that President Lasso has forged early on speak pretty well of his ability to reach compromise, but also will prove to be the biggest test for him as he moves forward across a number of really challenging issues that will test the political landscape in Ecuador and the desire maybe to reimagine and redefine the status quo. I think from a security perspective, as we've heard again over the course of these past 2 days, Ecuador worries about contagion effects of protests in neighboring countries. It worries about organized crime from those countries, particularly in light of its role receiving Venezuelan migrants and other migrants from neighboring countries and even not so neighboring countries. As we know, Ecuador has accepted thousands of refugees from Afghanistan. It worries about serving as a pass-through state for major drug producers in neighboring countries. It worries about threats to fisheries and now high rates of outward migration from Ecuador, which I would argue is a bit of a product of generalized instability, I would say, during the height of the pandemic and perhaps the latter half of the Lenin Moreno administration. And of course, climate change, I think, is top of mind for many people, including some of the speakers we've heard from over the past 2 days, but in particular today. I think in terms of early signs of the strategic importance of the bilateral relationship, we've seen a number of promising ones. I think the Biden administration sent a strong signal by sending a very high-level delegation to Ecuador in May to celebrate the inauguration of President Lasso. And we saw a bipartisan delegation of US senators visiting Quito in July, which came itself on the heels of a resolution out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in March, expressing really strong support for deepening economic relations, security, and development. I think Ecuador has emerged as one of the largest recipients of US foreign assistance in the region for fiscal year 2021, despite the fact that there have been a lot of moving parts in terms of those assistance packages this year in light of the pandemic. I think as for the Lasso government, there is great hope to engage on a number of issues. I think in particular on the trade and commercial side of the relationship, in the hopes of increasing foreign capital, in the hopes of formalizing areas of the economy, and in the hopes of just generally advancing the Lasso administration's economic agenda. But I think for any of this to come to pass, our reports encourage extremely deep and concerted engagement with relevant stakeholder communities, including indigenous communities, the agricultural sector, flowers, fisheries, and a number of others. Actually, I would say actually not just engagement, but consultation and continuing to uphold this promise of being a government del encuentro, as President Lasso has noted time and again during the course of his campaign and the early months of his presidency. I think in terms of a possible free trade agreement specifically, at present, the Ecuadorian government perhaps tactfully is moving full steam ahead with a possible FTA with Mexico, which would allow it to join the Pacific Alliance, this sort of regional grouping, including Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And that would in turn better position itself as the only country in that alliance without an FTA with the United States. I think if that Ecuador-Mexico trade agreement comes to pass, the US government might then take that as a signal to continue advancing with trade negotiations with Ecuador in the hope of establishing a sort of united trade front along the Pacific coast that is broadly open to trade with third parties. Still, I would note that obstacles abound on the US side, which I will unpack, but there are, we have seen a sort of rise in some protectionist tendencies, particularly in the US Congress, and I think that holds some risk for potential roadblocks down the line. I think all the while the Ecuador government, again, is tactfully engaging across a number of fronts with the US, clearly signaling its interest in deepening relations, not only in terms of trade, but all across the bilateral relationship. I think this, if we're being honest, really began under President Lenin Moreno, but it has been turbocharged under this new Lasso administration in a very big way. And I think under this banner of Más Ecuador en el Mundo, Ecuador has returned to the International Arbitration Institution, ICSID. I think it has returned to engaging on a deeper level with the international community more broadly, but really engaging with ICSID provides some security to international investors. It has shown an eagerness to engage on climate discussions and is beginning now to showcase a real commitment to addressing a number of major social and economic issues, including very recently chronic malnutrition in children, empowerment of women leaders, and real investments in education. I think all of those things are ripe for international cooperation with the US State Department and USAID. On the US side of the ledger, we've seen that the Biden administration has shown itself eager and willing to engage in a deeper way on a whole host of issues, including, but not limited to, climate, security, rule of law, economic revitalization. And I think it has indicated a deep desire to re-engage the region and the hemisphere and to prove itself a reliable partner for not just Ecuador, but for the hemisphere more broadly. As for a comprehensive FTA, as I alluded to just a moment ago, I think as many on this conference know, on the US side of things, the winds are moving in increasingly unpredictable directions, shall we say. I think we've seen a rise of protectionist tendencies now in both major US political parties, of course, the US Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The reasons for that, I think we could probably spend a whole week-long, if not month-long conference on. But I think some people now point to USMCA as a potential sign of hope. And I would caution to some degree against that, simply because though the USMCA, though the US-Mexico-Canada agreement provides some baseline as to what a quote-unquote modern agreement might look like, it did in many ways represent an update of sorts from the old NAFTA. And I think many would agree that it actually allowed Democrats to secure a number of major legislative victories on the environment and labor, even though it was signed by a Republican president. So just all that's to say, I think any argument about the ease of moving a comprehensive FTA forward based on USMCA's passage, in my view, belies some of the obstacles of moving parties into this kind of newly controversial space of negotiating an agreement of this sort. Saying all of that, I think therein actually lies the path ahead, not only for a possible FTA, but for US-Ecuador relations more broadly. On the one hand, recognizing the US government's commitment to Ecuador as a partner that it is keen to engage with on a deep level, but on the other, recognizing that the United States is going through a time of great polarization. And so messaging the benefits of certain policies becomes all the more important, and actually sequencing those policies becomes important as well. In the US Congress, I think one kind of tried and true method to move things is this idea of countering China, which I think has long proven to be an effective argument to encourage engagement. And I think that's one kind of path forward. Climate has become one of the biggest, if not the biggest, policy priorities for the Biden administration. And so signaling a willingness to commit to environmental protection, I would argue, is also key. And in Global Americans, one of our working papers is focused specifically on that. We have another actually that's focused specifically on climate change, one on the importance of environment in free trade agreements. Security arguments, I think, also tend to unify. And as Richard alluded to at the top, our report on indigenous rights in trade is also, I think, highly informative as to what could be moved, not only generally speaking, but also in the context of USMCA, which really struck a positive chord on the empowerment and protection of indigenous communities. It underscored the importance of increased engagement by indigenous peoples in trade and investment. And I think this whole process actually domestically of the Lasso administration engaging Pachakutik and other actors, but also more broadly incorporating that into any sort of trade discussion allows for a deeper engagement on US-Ecuador relations and provides an opportunity to build on the commitment that we saw with USMCA, that we've seen already with the Lasso government, and to deepen protections for indigenous rights. So I think, in my view, the most compelling path forward to deepening US-Ecuador bilateral relations is one that that summons the cry, if you will, or that falls under the banner of Build Back Better Together, as this conference is aptly named. And so I think we've seen on vaccines and pandemic recovery that the pandemic has in many ways shown a need to enlarge social safety nets, to envision a new status quo with countries with larger informal economies feeling the brunt of this pandemic, which has transcended borders and kept many of us living in this new normal for so long. But I would say also that the health effects of the COVID-19 pandemic were particularly harmful to Ecuador. It was particularly harmful to the entire region, but if we remember in the early months, Ecuador suffered a really severe blow with lockdowns that forced more people into unemployment, with a large portion of the population already living in poverty and in informal economies. And so I think deepening commercial and bilateral relations holds the possibility of not only expediting Ecuador's economic recovery at a time in which the US government is deepening its engagement with Ecuador, but also provides an opportunity to diversify markets, diversify exports, and address poverty alleviation, which is a longstanding humanitarian goal of the United States. And I think an argument based on deepening trade relations, which in turn might jumpstart economic growth and then create more legal, formal sector employment opportunities, would generate a whole host of alternatives to the illicit economy, and then just generally decrease the risk of financial contagion in the hemisphere. I think that sort of umbrella argument is a particularly compelling one as the US and Ecuador look to engage more deeply. So all that is to say, I think an investment across multiple fronts by the US government and Ecuador to strengthen ties, to stabilize economies, to reassure peoples, again, this idea that the US is back engaging in a deeper way, and to build back better together is of mutual interest and of mutual gain. And I think, as I mentioned at the top, there is a mutual recognition of the benefit of all of those things. And so we are now entering this really unique moment of US-Ecuador relations, where it seems as though a lot of the pieces are aligning in a very significant way, and a lot of the actors are moving in the right direction. But I think conferences like these with speakers that Richard has brought together are particularly helpful in illuminating some of the issues and then moving past them or moving kind of collaboratively through them. So with that, maybe I'll close, Richard, again with another note of gratitude to your wonderful audience that has stayed with us throughout this time, and then also looking forward to addressing any questions that you might have.
I thank you so much for an excellent assessment of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Ecuador. I've got some questions. I want to start with the issue of oil and gas and mining. This is a topic that came up this morning with the energy minister and came up again with the vice minister of environment. As we heard this morning, the government of Ecuador is planning to bolster its oil and gas projects. They've got a number of licitations going forward. They also have a number of new mining projects going forward. I asked this morning the Minister of Energy how they were going to address the issue of indigenous rights. He said that the government is committed to working proactively with indigenous communities. You, as an expert in this area that's been studying indigenous communities in Ecuador, how do you perceive this issue, and how do you believe the communities are reacting to the new administration and addressing some of these challenges that many of them have raised before in prior administrations?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Richard. I think what the minister mentioned earlier was spot on. I think the current government fully recognizes the importance of engaging with the indigenous communities. And I think our research has shown the massive benefit of engaging the communities throughout the course of any negotiation. And I think actually their voice becomes all the more relevant when the work of oil or mining companies affect their land. According to international conventions and international covenants, including the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, or ILO 169, Indigenous people have to participate in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of plans and programs which may affect them directly. And so that is part of kind of the analysis that we did in the first working paper that we released on Indigenous rights and trade. And I think, as you mentioned, the process side of this is just as important as the substance. which is to say consultation with indigenous peoples is critical. And in terms of where the indigenous communities stand on the prospects of increased oil production and mining, I actually think one has to distinguish a little bit which communities we're referring to. So among two leading actors are Konai and Pachakutik, the latter of which, as I mentioned, ran an extremely successful presidential campaign on a largely water environment-based platform among a whole host of other social and economic issues, whereas Konai, for its part, has taken a bit more of an antagonistic stance against the Lasso administration, has been demanding a number of things, namely the government increase in the prices of agricultural products for exports if the government wants its support. But I think in August, perhaps as an early sign of opposition from indigenous communities, we saw President Lasso sign a decree outlining an action plan for the mining sector, which did actually receive some criticism from Konai and Pachakutik. And as I mentioned, I think Lasso has shown early on a real conviction and investment in communicating with those coalition partners, communicating and respecting the voices of Pachakutik leadership in particular. And so I think the path forward will test Lasso's commitment to that very premise of dialogue and compromise, because as we know, it was leftist parties like Pachakutik and Izquierda Democrática that really helped propel Lasso into the presidential runoff against Arauz and ultimately into the presidency. So I think what we can expect is the growing influence of indigenous groups will likely push the government toward accepting new requirements that extractive industries consult with local groups before launching new projects. And again, that in fact was one of the recommendations that we made in our newly released report on US-Ecuador relations, this idea of really investing a whole of government effort, investing in regular consultation with indigenous communities.
Yeah, on this topic of consultation, one of the points in your report that I was struck with was the USMCA. A key facet of that was the active consultation and engagement of indigenous communities, starting with the First Nations in Canada. Canada made that as a priority. What role can indigenous communities in the US and Canada play in terms of sharing their lessons learned to promote greater genuine engagement and consultation in Ecuador?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think there are many ways of sharing lessons learned. And I think without a doubt, Canada's First Nations and Native American tribes have great expertise in dealing with trade agreements. I think the USMCA, as I think I mentioned in my remarks, actually includes provisions for the US, Canada, and Mexico to cooperate across borders to advance indigenous people's trade-related interests and promote indigenous-owned small and medium-sized enterprises. And I actually think that precedent of engagement sets up a sort of model for cross-regional collaboration, which we at Global Americans believe, and our high-level working group again believes, will be highly valuable for these communities as they seek ways to share experiences and share know-how. And I think trade negotiators would be well served to coordinate meetings with those communities, and they should also try to facilitate a space for Canada's First Nations and other Native American tribes to engage with Ecuador's indigenous communities to exchange experiences. Because I think ultimately those sorts of consultations would provide Ecuador's indigenous communities with a way of informing their approach to negotiations, but also would add a level of legitimacy and buy-in from the indigenous communities that would go a really long way in terms of moving the ball.
Yeah, thank you. We had a comment from Carlos Morgnor regarding China and the notion that perhaps the Pan-American Highway could be converted to a rail line to more effectively compete with China. Get your comments on that. But in general, I'd like you to talk further about the Pacific Alliance, because that point you made I thought was a valuable one, and the strategy that Ecuador is now pursuing to forge a free trade agreement with Mexico to position it for future FTA with the US, I thought was interesting. So if you could elaborate.
Yeah, so the US right now has a trade agreement signed with every Latin American country on the Pacific coast except Ecuador. Our view is that a trade agreement with Ecuador offers the possibility of creating a sort of united trade front along the Pacific coast. Under President Lasso's predecessor, President Lenin Moreno, Ecuador began this process of negotiating with Mexico and really negotiating with the Pacific Alliance more broadly, this idea of building out this regional trade grouping, which again includes Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And I think unlike the other major economic bloc in South America, the Mercosur, which includes Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, the Pacific Alliance is broadly open to trade with third parties. And so the idea, I think, the logic that the Ecuadorian government has taken, the Ministry of Trade has taken, has been that an agreement with Mexico would speed along Ecuador's kind of accession to the Pacific Alliance and place it in a stronger position to engage with the US. And for the US side of things, it provides a sort of unity to engage with the entire bloc. So I think strategically, it's a pretty sound move. And I think they've made a lot of progress in terms of the Mexico-Ecuador agreement. And if that were to come about, I think it would start moving the ball a bit further in terms of a US-Ecuador agreement.
Thank you, Guy. We had a good comment from the chat in the chat box from David Lewis from the Manchester group on the trade agreement, and he points out correctly that until Congress gives USTR authority to formally negotiate, there is not going to be any active process to formalize a US-Ecuador FTA. You alluded to some of the political challenges in Congress. Maybe you could talk further about that. And what are things that could be done by the business sector, by other stakeholders that value the bilateral relationship to educate folks in Congress as well as the broader public about the strategic importance of Ecuador in the global, in terms of the US's geopolitical focus in Latin America today, particularly on the anniversary of 9/11, on the 20th anniversary of 9/11.
Yeah. Well, many thanks for that question, David and Richard. So yeah, I think what we're seeing now in Congress, and again, I think I mentioned it just briefly in my remarks, is we've seen over the past couple of years the rise of protectionist tendencies on both sides of the aisle, and I think such that the idea of an FTA, at least in its old framing, is becoming a little bit less politically expedient and a bit more controversial. And so I think you hit the nail on the head, Richard, that part of the process of moving along that way would require just a showing between both governments that deepening engagement is worthwhile, not just trade, not just commercial relations, but diplomatic, security, immigration, a whole host of issues. And so I think as the US and Ecuador deepens its engagement across all of those fronts, it becomes all the more tenable to move forward on the commercial side, and of course to move forward on the investment and the trade side as well. And so I think the governments are moving in that direction, as was noted by David. I think the USTR is waiting in part to see what happens on House Ways and Means and what happens in terms of the political actors in Congress. And I think what is required is a showing among kind of stakeholders in Ecuador, stakeholders in the US, public and private sector, to show that this relationship matters and that given the turbulence that we've seen throughout the hemisphere, Ecuador is increasingly emerging as a more stable geopolitical partner and one that is keen to deepen engagement. And so one such way to do that is move forward in commercial and investment relations and trade relations. And I think it requires conferences like these and people like us talking about the importance of this relationship as things move forward, particularly in light of the moving parts all throughout the hemisphere.
Thank you, Guy. With this, I think we're going to conclude our session and our forum. I want to encourage all of you to visit Global American's website and in particular the various working papers that have been written focusing on the bilateral US-Ecuadorian relationship. Guy and his team are providing real thought leadership in there, so I really want to commend you for that. And the Institute of the Americas looks forward to greater collaboration with Global Americans in Ecuador and other areas of the region. And want to thank all of you that have stayed with us these past 2 days. I want to thank Integra Capital, the Burnham Foundation for supporting this forum, as well as UCTV. Thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to having you at future Institute programs, hopefully in the near future, live here in La Jolla and not on Zoom. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.